The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets near Buckingham Palace, as tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd was 12-year-old Sophie Bennett, a quiet girl with brown hair tied in a ponytail, visiting London with her school group from Birmingham. She clutched her phone nervously, trying to capture photos of the magnificent horses and their riders in their ceremonial uniforms. The red tunics and bearskin hats of the guards created a striking image. Against the palace gates, Sophie had become separated from her classmates about 15 minutes earlier. The crowd had surged forward when the ceremony began, and in the confusion of bodies pressing together, she had lost sight of her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, and her friends. Initially, Sophie had not panicked. She was a responsible girl who knew to stay calm in difficult situations. Her parents had taught her what to do if she ever got lost. She should stay in one place and wait, or ask a police officer for help. The problem was that Sophie could not see any police officers nearby. The crowd was too thick, too chaotic. Everywhere she looked, there were tourists with cameras, families with children, street vendors selling souvenirs. The noise was overwhelming. People spoke in dozens of different languages. Someone's backpack kept hitting her shoulder as they turned to take photos. Sophie felt her heart beginning to race as the reality of her situation settled in. She was alone in a foreign city. Separated from everyone she knew, Sophie decided to move toward the edge of the crowd, where she might have a better chance of spotting her teacher, or finding someone official who could help. She began carefully weaving through the packed bodies, saying "excuse me" repeatedly as she squeezed past tourists who barely noticed her. Some people frowned at her for blocking their view. Others did not acknowledge her at all. Sophie kept her eyes scanning the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of the blue jackets her classmates were wearing for easy identification during the trip. As she reached the outer edge of the crowd, Sophie felt a mixture of relief and new anxiety. There was more space to breathe here, but she was also further from the palace, where her teacher might be looking for her. She pulled out her phone and tried to call Mrs. Patterson, but the call would not connect. Perhaps the signal was poor with so many people in the area using their phones simultaneously. Sophie tried texting instead, typing quickly that she was lost, and near the side street, by the palace gates, a black taxi cab pulled up to the curb nearby, and Sophie barely noticed it at first. She was focused on her phone, waiting to see if her message would send. The cab sat there with its engine running, which struck Sophie as slightly odd since there was a proper taxi stand further down the street. She glanced up briefly, noticing that the driver was a middle-aged man with a beard, wearing a dark jacket. He was looking in her direction through the window. Sophie returned her attention to her phone, feeling increasingly worried. It had been nearly 20 minutes since she had lost her group. Surely Mrs. Patterson would have noticed by now and would be looking for her. The school had strict rules about staying together. Sophie imagined her teacher frantically counting heads and realizing one student was missing. She hoped they had not left the area to search elsewhere. The taxi driver opened his door and stepped out of the vehicle. Sophie noticed this in her peripheral vision but did not think much of it initially. Perhaps he was stretching his legs while waiting for a passenger. But then he began walking directly toward her with purposeful strides. Sophie felt a prickle of unease run down her spine. Something about his approach felt wrong, though she could not immediately identify what. The man reached her quickly, moving faster than seemed casual. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. Sophie instinctively took a small step backward, clutching her phone tighter. The man spoke in a friendly tone, asking if she was lost and needed help getting somewhere. His words were kind, but every instinct in Sophie's body was screaming that something was not right. Her parents had taught her about stranger danger, about trusting her gut feelings when something felt off. Sophie politely told the man that she was fine and was just waiting for her teacher. She tried to make her voice sound confident, though her hands were shaking. The man persisted, saying he had heard her trying to make a phone call and could drive her to wherever she needed to go. He gestured toward his cab, suggesting it would be easier than waiting in the crowd. Sophie firmly declined, taking another step away from him. She looked around desperately, hoping to see a police officer or her teacher, anyone who could help. The man's demeanor changed slightly. His smile became more forced, and there was an edge to his voice now. He insisted that he was just trying to help, that she looked distressed, that getting in the cab would solve her problem quickly. He moved closer, reaching out as if to guide her by the arm toward the vehicle. Sophie pulled away sharply, her heart now pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She said no loudly, clearly, hoping someone nearby would notice the situation. But the tourists around them were absorbed in the ceremony and their own activities. No one seemed to be paying attention to the 12-year-old girl and the man who was becoming increasingly insistent. The driver grabbed Sophie's wrist, his grip tight and uncomfortable. He was no longer pretending to be friendly. His face was stern as he told her to stop being difficult and get in the cab. Sophie tried to pull her arm free, but he was much stronger than she was. Terror flooded through Sophie as she realized the danger she was in. This man was trying to force her into his vehicle. She opened her mouth to scream, but fear had frozen her voice. She could only manage a strangled sound that was lost in the noise of the crowd. The man began pulling her toward the cab, and Sophie stumbled, her feet scraping against the pavement as she tried to resist. Her phone fell from her hand and clattered to the ground. In that moment of absolute fear, Sophie heard a sound that would save her life. The sharp, powerful whinny of a horse cut through the air, followed immediately by the thundering of hooves on cobblestone. The ceremonial guard horse, a massive bay gelding named Perseus, broken from its position and was charging directly toward them with its rider guiding it with expert precision. The royal guard astride Perseus was Corporal James Mitchell, 20-year-old soldier who had served in the household cavalry for 6 years. During ceremonial duties, guards were trained to maintain strict discipline and focus, keeping their eyes forward and ignoring distractions from the crowd. But James had developed an instinct over his years of service, a sixth sense that alerted him when something in the crowd was not right. He had seen the interaction unfold between the man and the young girl, had noticed her body language screaming distress, had recognized the moment when help turned to force. James made a split-second decision that would break protocol, but potentially save a life. He guided Perseus away from the ceremonial formation, applying pressure with his legs and reins to direct the powerful horse toward the unfolding crisis. Perseus responded immediately to his rider's commands. The horse was trained for crowd control and unexpected situations. Together, they moved with speed and purpose that sent tourists scrambling out of their path. The man holding Sophie's wrist looked up in shock as the massive horse bore down on them. Perseus was 17 hands high, weighing well over 1,000 pounds of pure muscle and power. The sight of such an animal charging toward him with a soldier in full ceremonial uniform atop broke the man's grip on Sophie immediately. He released her wrist and stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear and surprise. Sophie fell to her knees on the pavement, gasping for breath, her body shaking with adrenaline and relief. James brought Perseus to a halt between Sophie and the taxi driver, the horse's body forming a living barrier that separated the girl from her attacker. Perseus stood firm, his ears pinned back slightly. His presence alone enough to communicate danger to the man who had moments ago been trying to force a child into his vehicle. James sat tall in the saddle, his expression stern and authoritative beneath his bearskin hat. He commanded the man to step away from the girl and remain where he was. The taxi driver's face had gone pale. He began backing toward his cab, stammering excuses about a misunderstanding, claiming he was only trying to help a lost child. His words tumbled over each other in his haste to explain away his actions. But James had witnessed the entire interaction. He had seen the man grab Sophie's wrist, had seen her trying to pull away, had recognized the clear signs of an attempted abduction. There was no misunderstanding here, only a predator caught in the act. James spoke into his radio, his voice calm and professional despite the situation's intensity. He reported the incident to the duty officer and requested immediate police assistance at his location. His training kept his emotions controlled, though inside he felt a cold anger at what he had just witnessed. How many times had this man done this before? How many children might he have successfully taken before today? The thought made James's jaw tighten beneath his ceremonial chinstrap. Other members of the household cavalry had noticed the disruption in their formation. 2 more mounted guards peeled away from the ceremony to provide backup, their horses moving swiftly through the crowd. Tourists who had been focused on the ceremony now turned their attention to the drama unfolding on the side street. Cameras and phones turned toward the scene. People began asking each other what was happening, trying to piece together the situation from what they could see. Sophie remained on the ground, her whole body trembling. She looked up at the enormous horse, standing protectively in front of her, and felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. Perseus's tail swished calmly, despite the tension of the moment. The horse stood rock solid, a wall of safety between Sophie and the man who had tried to take her. James glanced down at the girl, his expression softening slightly. He asked if she was hurt, keeping his voice gentle to avoid frightening her further. Sophie shook her head, unable to form words yet. Her throat felt tight with unshed tears. She managed to whisper that she was okay, just scared. James nodded, understanding completely. He assured her that she was safe now, that police were coming, and that they would help her find her teacher. His words, spoken with calm authority, helped ground Sophie. She took several deep breaths, trying to stop her hands from shaking. The taxi driver realized his situation was becoming increasingly desperate. More guards had arrived. A crowd was forming. People were pointing at him and talking urgently to each other. He made a sudden decision to run, turning and sprinting toward his cab. But he had underestimated how quickly the situation had been contained. One of the newly arrived guards had already dismounted and moved to block the cab's door. The driver skidded to a halt, trapped between mounted guards and growing crowd of witnesses. Within minutes, Metropolitan police officers arrived on the scene. Having been nearby for crowd control during the ceremony, James provided a concise report of what he had witnessed, his military training making him an excellent observer and reporter of facts. Multiple tourists stepped forward, volunteering that they had filmed the assassin on their phones and would gladly provide the footage as evidence. The taxi driver's claims of innocent intentions crumbled under the weight of multiple witness accounts and video documentation. The police arrested the man, reading him his rights as they placed him in handcuffs. His cab was immediately impounded for investigation. Officers would later discover that the vehicle was not a licensed taxi at all, but a personal car outfitted to resemble one. A common tactic among predators who targeted vulnerable people. The fake license and registration would lead investigators to uncover a troubling pattern of similar incidents in tourist-heavy areas around London. While police processed the arrest, a female officer knelt beside Sophie, speaking to her gently and checking that she was physically unharmed. Sophie's wrist bore red marks where the man had gripped her, but there were no serious injuries. The officer wrapped a blanket around Sophie's shoulders, recognizing the shock and trauma the girl was experiencing. She explained that they would help find Sophie's teacher and that Sophie had been incredibly brave. Mrs. Patterson arrived moments later, having been alerted by other teachers that something had happened near the palace gates involving a student. When she saw Sophie wrapped in a blanket with police officers around her, the teacher's face went white with fear. She rushed forward, and Sophie burst into tears upon seeing her teacher's familiar face. Mrs. Patterson embraced the girl tightly, apologizing repeatedly for losing track of her in the crowd. Though the incident was hardly her fault, given the circumstances, James remained mounted on Perseus throughout the police investigation, providing his statement while still maintaining some presence in case he was needed further. Other guards had returned to their duties, but James stayed until he was certain the situation was completely resolved and Sophie was safe with her teacher. He watched as the girl gradually calmed down, her breathing becoming more regular, her tears slowing. Sophie finally looked up at the guard who had saved her, really seeing him properly for the first time. James sat straight and dignified on Perseus, his red tunic and ceremonial helmet making him appear larger than life. But his eyes, visible beneath the bearskin hat, were kind and concerned. Sophie found her voice and managed to say thank you, the words barely audible, but filled with genuine gratitude. James nodded respectfully, telling her that she had done well to resist and that she was very brave. Before James could return to his duties, a senior officer from the Household Cavalry arrived to assess the situation. Major Richard Thornton had been informed of the incident and came immediately to ensure both his soldier and the civilian involved were properly cared for. He spoke briefly with James, commending his quick thinking and decisive action. The major understood that breaking formation during a ceremony was a serious breach of protocol, but in this case, the circumstances absolutely warranted the decision. Major Thornton then approached Sophie and Mrs. Patterson. He introduced himself formally. Explaining his role as commanding officer of the guard unit, he wanted to personally ensure that Sophie received any support she needed. Mrs. Patterson expressed her profound gratitude for Corporal Mitchell's intervention, her voice shaking with emotion as she considered what might have happened if the guard had not been paying attention. The major assured her that the household cavalry took its protective duties seriously, both ceremonial and practical. The police completed their initial investigation and obtained contact information from Sophie and her teacher for follow-up interviews. A child welfare officer was called to assess Sophie's emotional state and determine if additional support services were needed. The officer spoke with Sophie privately, asking gentle questions about what had happened and how she was feeling. Sophie answered honestly, admitting she felt scared and shaken, but also incredibly grateful to be safe. The welfare officer provided information about counseling services available through the school and encouraged Sophie's parents to watch for signs of trauma in the coming days and weeks. News of the incident spread rapidly through social media. Tourists who had filmed the dramatic intervention posted their videos online. Within hours, the footage was being shared thousands of times. The images of the Royal Guard horse charging forward to shield a young girl from an attacker captured public imagination. Comments flooded in praising Corporal Mitchell's actions and expressing relief that Sophie was safe. The story was picked up by news outlets, first local London media, and then national and international news organizations. By evening, James Mitchell found himself at the center of an unexpected media storm. Reporters requested interviews with the soldier who had broken protocol to save a child. The Ministry of Defense Public Affairs Office was inundated with media inquiries. Military leadership had to carefully balance public interest with operational security and the privacy of those involved. They decided to release a brief statement acknowledging the incident and confirming that a member of the household cavalry had intervened to protect a child from a potential abduction. James himself was uncomfortable with the attention. He was a private person who had simply done what he felt was right in the moment. The idea of being labeled a hero felt strange to him. He had acted on instinct and training, seeing a threat and responding to neutralize it. In his mind, any decent person would have done the same thing. But his superiors explained that his actions had not only saved Sophie, but it also demonstrated the vigilance and dedication of the armed forces to public safety. Sophie returned to Birmingham with her school group the next day, her parents having been thoroughly briefed on what had happened. Her mother, Susan, and father David met the coach when it arrived, embracing their daughter tightly with tears streaming down their faces. They had received the phone call from Mrs. Patterson the previous evening and had spent a sleepless night imagining the worst possible outcomes. Seeing Sophie safe and relatively unharmed, it's an overwhelming relief that left them emotionally drained. The Bennett family struggled in the days following the incident. Sophie experienced nightmares about the man grabbing her wrist and trying to force her into the cab. She would wake up gasping, her heart racing, reliving those terrifying moments. Susan stayed close to her daughter, providing comfort and reassurance. David found himself battling his own emotions, feeling angry that someone had tried to hurt his child and guilty that he had not been there to protect her. The family decided to pursue counseling together to process the trauma. At school, Sophie was treated with kid gloves by teachers and students alike. Everyone had heard about what happened in London. Her classmates asked endless questions about the incident, wanting to hear every detail. Some treated Sophie like a celebrity, which made her uncomfortable. She did not want to be famous for nearly being kidnapped. Others were more thoughtful, simply expressing that they were glad she was okay. Sophie appreciated those quieter gestures of support more than the dramatic attention. Mrs. Patterson met with Sophie and her parents to apologize formally for the separation that had occurred. The teacher was devastated that one of her students had been put in danger during what should have been an educational and enjoyable trip. Susan and David assured her that they did not blame her. The situation had been chaotic, and Sophie had made her own decision to move through the crowd. What mattered most was that Sophie was safe, largely thanks to the quick action of Corporal Mitchell. The police investigation into Sophie's attacker revealed disturbing information. The man, identified as 43-year-old Marcus Webb, had a previous record of offenses involving children, though he had served his sentence years ago and was supposedly rehabilitated. The fake taxi setup suggested premeditation and planning. Investigators suspected he had been targeting tourists, particularly children who might be separated from their groups. The authorities were working to determine if there were other victims who had not come forward or, worse, who had not been as fortunate as Sophie. Webb was charged with attempted kidnapping, impersonating a licensed taxi driver, and several other related offenses. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including multiple video recordings from tourist phones showing him grabbing Sophie and attempting to force her toward his vehicle. His defense attorney would later attempt to argue for reduced charges based on claims that Webb had genuinely intended to help. But the prosecution's case was solid. Webb's past record and the clear footage of his aggressive behavior toward Sophie made his intentions unmistakable. Sophie received a letter. 2 weeks after the incident, it arrived in a formal envelope with an official seal addressed specifically to her. Susan opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note from Corporal James Mitchell. He had written to check on Sophie's well-being and to commend her bravery during a frightening situation. The letter was respectful and kind, striking just the right tone. James explained that he had a younger sister about Sophie's age and could not imagine something like this happening to her. The letter deeply moved Sophie. She read it multiple times, feeling a connection to the soldier who had saved her. James had included his email address, approved by his commanding officer, and invited Sophie to write back if she wished. He emphasized that there was no pressure to respond, but that he would be happy to answer any questions she might have about that day or about his work with the household cavalry. Sophie decided she wanted to reply, and spent an evening carefully composing her response with her parents' help. Sophie's reply to James was heartfelt and genuine. She thanked him for saving her life and explained how scared she had been in those moments when the man was pulling her toward the cab. She wrote about her nightmares and her counseling sessions, wanting to be honest about the impact the incident had on her. Sophie also asked questions about Perseus, the horse who had formed such an impressive physical barrier between her and her attacker. She wanted to know about the horse's training and personality. Curious about the animal who had played such a crucial role in her rescue, James was touched by Sophie's openness and bravery in sharing her struggles. He wrote back promptly, addressing each of her questions with thoughtful detail. He explained that Perseus was an 8-year-old Irish sport horse who had been with the household cavalry for 4 years. The horse was trained extensively for crowd control, ceremonial duties, and unexpected situations. Perseus had a calm temperament but was also highly alert and responsive to his rider's commands. James described how he and Perseus had developed a strong partnership through years of working together. Learning to communicate through subtle cues, the correspondence between Sophie and James continued over the following months, always monitored and approved by both Sophie's parents and James's commanding officers. The letters were therapeutic for both of them in different ways. Sophie found comfort in maintaining a connection with the person who had saved her, and writing about her feelings helped her process the trauma. James gained perspective on the real impact his actions had made, understanding that his split-second decision had preserved not just Sophie's immediate safety, but her entire future. Through their letters, Sophie learned about James's background and what had led him to join the household cavalry. He came from a military family in Yorkshire. His father had served in the Royal Artillery, and his grandfather had been in the cavalry during his own service. James had always loved horses and had grown up riding. Joining the household cavalry allowed him to combine his passion for horses with his desire to serve his country. He described the pride he felt in maintaining centuries-old traditions while also serving a practical protective role in modern London. James learned about Sophie's life as well. She was an excellent student who loved reading and art. She had a younger brother named Thomas who looked up to her. Sophie enjoyed playing football with her school team and had recently started learning guitar. The incident in London had shaken her confidence. She was working hard with her counselor to regain her sense of security and independence. Sophie's determination to not let the experience define her entire life impressed James greatly. The media attention around the incident gradually faded as new stories captured public interest, but the impact on everyone involved continued to unfold in less visible ways. The household cavalry reviewed its protocols regarding when guards could break formation to address civilian emergencies. While maintaining ceremonial discipline remained important, commanders acknowledged that soldiers must also be prepared to respond to genuine threats. James's actions became a case study in proper judgment and decisive action under pressure. The Metropolitan Police used the incident as part of their public awareness campaigns about child safety in tourist areas. They produced educational materials warning parents about the tactics used by predators and encouraging children to trust their instincts when approached by strangers. Sophie's case, though traumatic, helped potentially prevent similar incidents by raising awareness. The police also increased their presence in areas where tourist crowds gathered, specifically watching for suspicious behavior around children. Sophie's school implemented new safety protocols for future trips. Teachers were equipped with two-way radios to maintain constant communication. Students were assigned to buddy groups that stayed together at all times. Each child was given a card with emergency contact information and their hotel address. Mrs. Patterson, despite not being at fault for Sophie's separation, took the incident personally and became a vocal advocate for improved student safety measures on school trips. Perseus, the horse who had charged so dramatically to Sophie's aid, became something of a celebrity within the household cavalry. His stablemates jokingly called him the hero horse. The cavalry's social media accounts shared Perseus's story. With permission from all parties involved, and the horse gained thousands of followers. People sent treats and letters addressed to Perseus expressing their admiration for the brave horse. The attention was unusual, but it also served to educate the public about the extensive training and intelligence of cavalry horses. Marcus. Webb's trial took place 6 months after the incident. Sophie had to provide testimony, which her parents initially worried would re-traumatize her. However, the prosecution team was experienced in working with young witnesses. They prepared Sophie thoroughly, explaining exactly what would happen in court and what questions she would be asked. A victim support officer stayed with Sophie and her family throughout the process. When Sophie took the stand, she spoke clearly and honestly about what had happened, her voice steady, despite her nervousness. James also testified at the trial, providing his eyewitness account as a trained observer. His military bearing and clear factual testimony made a strong impression on the jury. He described in precise detail what he had seen, from the moment Sophie appeared uncomfortable with the man's approach to the moment. Webb grabbed her wrist and began pulling her toward the vehicle. James's testimony corroborated Sophie's account perfectly and was supported by the video evidence from multiple tourist phones. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Webb was sentenced to 12 years in prison with an extended license period afterward. The judge commented on the calculated nature of Webb's actions and the clear danger he posed to children. She commended both Sophie's bravery in resisting and testifying, and Corporal Mitchell's vigilance and quick action. The sentence brought a sense of closure to Sophie and her family. Knowing that Webb would not be able to hurt other children for a significant period, after the trial concluded, Sophie's parents arranged a special visit to London. They wanted Sophie to have positive experiences in the city to counteract the trauma of her previous visit. But more importantly, they had coordinated with the Ministry of Defense to allow Sophie to meet James and Perseus properly at the cavalry barracks. The meeting had been carefully planned to ensure it was appropriate and beneficial for everyone involved, particularly Sophie. The day of the visit was bright and sunny. Sophie dressed carefully, nervous and excited in equal measure. She had corresponded with James for months, but had never met him outside of those terrifying moments when he had ridden to her rescue. The family arrived at the barracks and was greeted by Major Thornton, who personally escorted them to the stables. Sophie's heart raced with anticipation. She was finally going to meet Perseus and thank James properly for what he had done. James was waiting in his service uniform rather than full ceremonial dress, looking more approachable and human without the imposing bearskin hat. When he saw Sophie, he smiled warmly and greeted her and her family with genuine pleasure. Sophie felt immediately at ease with him despite her initial nervousness. They shook hands formally, and then James led them to Perseus's stall. The massive bay horse stood, calmly munching hay, his intelligent eyes watching the visitors with interest. Sophie approached Perseus slowly, remembering James's letters about the proper way to interact with horses. She held out her hand for Perseus to sniff. The big horse lowered his head gently, his nostrils flaring as he investigated her scent. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes as she touched the soft nose of the horse who had stood as a shield between her and danger. Perseus seemed to sense the emotion of the moment, standing perfectly still and allowing Sophie to stroke his face and neck. James watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction. Pleased that Sophie was making peace with the traumatic memory, James gave Sophie and her family a tour of the stables, introducing them to several other horses and explaining the daily routines of the cavalry. He showed them the grooming equipment, the different types of saddles used for various duties, and the extensive tack that was part of ceremonial dress. Sophie's younger brother Thomas was fascinated by everything, asking countless questions that James answered with patience and humor. The normalcy of the visit helped Sophie see James as a complete person, rather than just the figure who had appeared dramatically in her moment of crisis. The visit included lunch in the officers' mess, where Major Thornton joined them for a meal. The conversation was relaxed and pleasant. Major Thornton shared stories about the history of the household cavalry, dating back centuries to when mounted soldiers were the primary military force. He explained how the modern cavalry balanced maintaining historical traditions with adapting to contemporary security needs. Sophie's parents appreciated the time and care the military was taking with their daughter, recognizing that this visit was part of her healing process. After lunch, James had arranged something special. With proper safety equipment and supervision, Sophie would have the opportunity to sit on Perseus in the stable yard. Sophie's face lit up with excitement and nervousness. She had never been on a horse before, and the idea of sitting on the same horse that had saved her felt deeply meaningful. James helped her into a riding helmet and gave her careful instructions on how to mount safely with his assistance. With James supporting her and holding Perseus's reins, Sophie climbed onto the horse's back. She sat in the saddle, high above the ground, feeling the warmth and strength of the animal beneath her. Perseus stood rock steady, as calm as if he carried nervous beginners every day. James led them in a slow walk around the stable yard, keeping one hand on Perseus's bridle. Sophie's parents watched with cameras ready, capturing the moment their daughter overcame her fear and found joy in connection with the horse who had protected her. The experience was transformative for Sophie. Sitting on Perseus, feeling safe and in control, helped replace the helpless terror she had felt that day in London. She was no longer just a victim of an attempted crime. She was a girl who had survived, who had testified bravely, and who was now confidently riding the famous cavalry horse. James could see the change in her demeanor, the way her posture straightened and her smile became more genuine. This visit was accomplishing exactly what everyone had hoped it would before leaving the barracks. Sophie presented James with a gift. She had spent weeks working on a painting depicting Perseus in his ceremonial tack, standing proud and strong. The artwork was surprisingly sophisticated for a 12-year-old, showing genuine talent and attention to detail. James was deeply moved by the gesture, accepting the painting with sincere gratitude. He promised to hang it in his quarters, where he would see it daily. Sophie also gave Perseus a bag of horse treats that she had carefully selected based on James's letters about what Perseus enjoyed. The goodbye was emotional but positive. Sophie hugged James, thanking him again for saving her life. James told her how proud he was of her courage and strength, both during the incident and throughout the difficult months that followed. He encouraged her to continue her counseling, to pursue her art, and to never let one bad experience prevent her from living fully. His words were exactly what Sophie needed to hear, giving her permission to move forward while acknowledging the legitimacy of her feelings. The Bennett family left the barracks with full hearts. The visit had exceeded their expectations. Sophie talked animatedly during the drive home about Perseus, the other horses. In her conversation with James, her enthusiasm was a marked contrast to the withdrawn, a frightened child she had been immediately after the incident. Susan and David exchanged relieved glances, recognizing that their daughter had turned an important corner in her recovery. The nightmare was becoming integrated into her life story rather than defining it entirely. Sophie's healing continued in the months that followed. The nightmares became less frequent and less intense. She returned to her normal activities with renewed confidence. Her artwork improved dramatically, with horses becoming a frequent subject. Sophie began taking riding lessons at a local stable, discovering a passion for equestrian activities. Her instructor commented on her natural affinity with horses and her respectful, gentle approach to the animals. Sophie knew exactly where that understanding had come from. At school, Sophie started a safety awareness program for younger students. She partnered with local police to develop age-appropriate presentations. It's about stranger danger and what to do if lost or threatened. Sophie's personal experience gave her credibility and passion for the subject. She spoke to classes of children, sharing her story in terms they could understand and providing practical advice. Teachers praised the program's effectiveness, noting that children paid attention to Sophie's message in ways they might not with adult instructors. James continued his duties with the household cavalry, but the incident had changed him in subtle ways. He found himself more attuned to the civilian crowds during ceremonies. His awareness heightened to potential threats or people in distress. His fellow soldiers noticed his increased vigilance and teased him about being the protector of London. James took the ribbing in good humor, but privately felt the weight of responsibility more acutely. He had seen firsthand how quickly a situation could turn dangerous, and how crucial immediate intervention could be. The correspondence between James and Sophie continued, though less frequently, as both their lives became busier. They exchanged letters every few months, updating each other on significant events and changes. James learned about Sophie's progress in school, her riding lessons, and her safety awareness program. Sophie heard about James's promotion to sergeant, new horses joining the cavalry, and interesting ceremonial duties he performed. The connection remained meaningful to both, a reminder of how their paths had crossed in such dramatic circumstances. Perseus continued his service with the household cavalry, performing his duties with the same calm professionalism he had always shown. The horse seemed unaware of his fame, focused simply on his work and his relationship with James. But stable staff noticed that Perseus had developed a particular gentleness around children who visited the barracks. The horse would lower his head for small hands to reach, standing perfectly still while young visitors patted his neck. It was as if Perseus understood the impact of his actions that day near Buckingham Palace. Sophie's family established an annual tradition of visiting London around the anniversary of the incident. They would spend a day in the city doing tourist activities that Sophie had missed during her school trip. The visits helped Sophie reclaim London as a place of positive experiences rather than just trauma. They always made time to visit James and Perseus at the barracks when possible, maintaining the connection that had formed from crisis. These visits became highlights of Sophie's year, something she looked forward to with genuine excitement. 2 years after the terrifying incident, Sophie received an invitation to participate in a documentary about child safety and emergency responder bravery. The producers approached her family with respect and sensitivity, explaining how Sophie's story could educate families and potentially prevent similar situations from occurring. After careful consideration and discussions with Sophie's counselor, the family decided to participate. Sophie was now 14 years old and felt emotionally ready to share her experience in a meaningful way that might help protect other children. The documentary filming spanned several days, during which Sophie spoke with remarkable eloquence about her harrowing experience. She described the fear that had gripped her when she realized she was in danger and the overwhelming relief she felt when James and Perseus intervened to save her. Sophie emphasized important safety lessons, including the critical importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, and the value of maintaining calm during frightening situations. She discussed her recovery process with honest vulnerability, speaking openly about the nightmares and anxiety she had endured. Her willingness to share these difficult details made her story powerful and deeply relatable to viewers of all ages. James was also interviewed extensively for the documentary. He discussed the split-second decision-making process during those critical moments, explaining how his military training and natural instincts had guided his protective actions. James spoke passionately about the responsibility soldiers felt to protect civilians, even when doing so meant breaking protocol or putting themselves at personal risk. He praised Sophie's extraordinary courage, both during the terrifying incident itself and throughout her difficult recovery journey afterward. The documentary crew also filmed Perseus, capturing footage of the magnificent horse performing his ceremonial duties and interacting gently with visitors at the cavalry barracks. The documentary aired on national television and received widespread critical acclaim and audience praise. Viewers across the country were deeply moved by Sophie's resilience and James's quick thinking under pressure. Schools throughout the region requested permission to show the documentary in their safety education programs. Parent groups organized viewings and discussions around the film's important lessons. The documentary sparked vital conversations about child safety in public spaces and the need for community vigilance. Sophie and James had successfully transformed their traumatic experience into educational content that could protect countless other children. Following the documentary's broadcast, Sophie received dozens of heartfelt letters from viewers. Other young people who had experienced frightening situations wrote to thank her for sharing her story and helping them feel less isolated in their trauma. Parents expressed profound gratitude for the safety lessons presented so effectively in the film. Many viewers shared their own stories of times when strangers had helped them or their children during difficult moments. The overwhelming response reinforced for Sophie that being open about difficult experiences could create meaningful connections and promote healing for many people beyond herself. Marcus Webb remained imprisoned, with all his appeals having been systematically denied. Investigators eventually connected him to 2 other attempted abductions that had previously gone unreported. Those victims, encouraged and inspired by Sophie's bravery in testifying publicly, came forward with their own accounts of Webb's predatory behavior. Webb faced additional serious charges and received extended sentencing. The knowledge that her courageous actions had helped bring complete justice gave Sophie a profound sense of closure. She had not merely survived, but had actively helped ensure that Webb could never harm other children. Sophie's safety awareness program expanded dramatically beyond her initial school project. She began speaking at regional conferences about child protection, often appearing alongside experienced law enforcement officers and child welfare experts. Her youth and personal experience gave her a unique and powerful perspective that resonated deeply with both children and adults. Sophie developed comprehensive teaching materials and worked directly with schools across the region to implement effective safety education programs. What had started as a modest school project had grown into something that positively touched thousands of lives. James received a well-deserved promotion to color sergeant, recognizing not just his years of dedicated service, but his exemplary conduct and sound judgment. His superiors noted that his actions during Sophie's incident had demonstrated the highest standards expected of the household cavalry. James wore his new rank with justifiable pride but remained characteristically humble about the attention and recognition he received. He continued mentoring younger soldiers, consistently emphasizing the critical importance of awareness and willingness to act decisively when civilians needed help. Perseus retired from active ceremonial service at the age of 11. Having completed his years of distinguished duty with honor, the horse earned a peaceful retirement at a specialized military facility where former cavalry horses lived comfortably. James visited Perseus regularly, maintaining their deep bond even though they no longer worked together daily. Sophie and her family made a special pilgrimage to visit Perseus in his retirement, bringing carrots and apples as treats. The old horse clearly remembered them, nickering softly and accepting their affection with his characteristic gentle dignity. Sophie continued her riding lessons and developed considerable equestrian skill. She competed successfully in local events and volunteered regularly at a therapeutic riding center where disabled children learned to ride. Working with horses and helping vulnerable children gave Sophie a powerful sense of purpose and meaningful connection. She often reflected on how Perseus had helped her heal. She wanted to facilitate similar therapeutic experiences for others. The Therapeutic Writing Center's director quickly recognized Sophie's special gift for connecting with both horses and traumatically injured children. On the third anniversary of the incident, the Metropolitan Police organized a community safety event where Sophie was invited as a featured guest speaker. James attended in his formal dress uniform, providing supportive presence as Sophie addressed a large crowd about her experience and the vital importance of community vigilance. Sophie spoke with impressive confidence and clarity. No longer the frightened 12-year-old, but a mature young woman who had transformed personal trauma into public purpose. The audience responded with a standing ovation, deeply moved by her remarkable journey and inspired by her unwavering dedication to helping others avoid similar experiences. After the event concluded, Sophie and James spent time talking privately about how dramatically their lives had changed since that fateful day. James shared exciting news that he was engaged to be married and that his fiancée felt like she already knew Sophie from hearing so many stories. Sophie told James about her concrete plans to study psychology at university with specific focus on trauma recovery in children. She wanted to dedicate her career to helping other young people who had experienced frightening situations. James told her sincerely that he could not imagine a better career choice for someone with her remarkable empathy and authentic lived experience. Sophie's parents watched their daughter interact warmly with James and reflected deeply on the incredible journey their family had traveled together. What had started as their absolute worst nightmare had ultimately led to personal growth, clear purpose, and profoundly meaningful connections. Susan and David had learned that trauma did not inevitably have to destroy a person or family. With proper support, genuine courage, and fierce determination, traumatic experiences could be integrated into a life story without defining it entirely or limiting future possibilities.